what you think of Colonel Kuklinski, and I will tell you who you are and how well you understand the tragic nature of our history. Minister of Defense Radosław Sikorski at the opening of the Kuklinski Museum in Warsaw. From Sarajevo to Red Africa's production side is currently working on filming a series about the history of Poland and one of Poland's most devoted families. Although we usually try to use the History She Wrote episodes to discuss current events in the context of history, the next few episodes will be devoted to events from Polish history specifically. Although they may not mirror a specific event, it is patently obvious to anyone the central place that Poland currently has in world events. To understand the present, we must understand the past. A good place to start is with Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski, who was designated the first Polish officer in NATO by Zbigniew Brzezinski. To his American intelligence handlers, Kuklinski was known by the name Jack Strong, and he was the most important source of information about the Warsaw Pact nations in Eastern Europe for about 10 years, from 1972 to the end of 1981. Poland experienced a brief 20 years of independence during the interwar period of the 20th century. Before the end of World War I, the nation had been partitioned by Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. World War II became a world conflagration in 1939 when Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously invaded. Germany was defeated, but the Soviet Union stayed. It was a brutal time in history, particularly as those in the Home Army and Polish intelligentsia were weeded out in basement NKVD torture chambers throughout the country. Using the spread of communism as its excuse for empire, Eastern Europe became a series of Soviet satellite states. The world was squaring up behind two superpowers, and when West Germany was allowed to join NATO, the East developed its own mutual defense organization in the Warsaw Pact. Unlike NATO, however, the Warsaw Pact kept the Soviets in exclusive control, even in peacetime, of regional commands, the most strategic positions, and, of course, any nuclear weapons. It was signed in the Presidential Palace in Warsaw in 1955, to kind of draw away from the idea that the Soviet Union was in control. No one was fooled. In 1968, Warsaw Pact troops were used to quell the Prague Spring, to bring Czechoslovakia back under the Soviet control. One of the Polish officers sent on this exercise, Kuklinski's worldview was shaken. Soviet treatment of workers' demonstrations in Poland in 1970 caused his shaken worldview to shatter. I would also like to assure you that I am deeply aware of the enormous need for pulling out of the shadows of darkness of the tightly closed communist system everything which does not serve peace of the world and freedom of nations, Kuklinski would later explain in a letter. His shattered worldview would be a key component of the end of the Cold War. Kuklinski's role in the Polish army gave him access to highly classified information, and he used it to develop exercises based on the Soviet war plans, including one which simulated the handing over of nuclear warheads in Poland. Although Soviet exercises stated that movements were in response to an unprovoked NATO strike, Kuklinski could plainly see that the Soviet Union was actually making offensive and not defensive plans. The Soviets believed that NATO would respond to any invasion of NATO states with an immediate nuclear strike, and such strikes would first hit Poland and Czechoslovakia. To quote Lord Farquaad in the movie Shrek, "Some of you may have to die, but it is a sacrifice I'm willing to make." With a projected 2 million Polish deaths and only the beginning, Kuklinski could see that Poland was completely disposable within the very pact that bore the name of its capital city. As he later stated, "Our front could only be a sacrifice of Polish blood at the altar of the Red Empire." In 1971, he made contact with the U.S. through the embassy in Bonn, Germany, and he began to pass critical Warsaw Pact documents and maps to a handler codenamed Daniel. For nearly 10 years, these Dear Daniel letters and updates provided a level of information never before seen about Warsaw Pact activities and, even in one case, a Russian missile base in Kazakhstan. To hide his spying activities, Kuklinski took up the hobby of photography and set up a darkroom in his house. He photographed and developed photographs of anything and everything, and scattered amongst the photographic debris were photographs of the Warsaw Pact documents and sites. It fit his sense of humor and irony that the camera he used for this, a Soviet model, had actually been a gift to him by the Warsaw Pact commander after a particularly well-designed exercise. Kuklinski's 10-year career as a spy was incredibly dangerous, and he was nearly discovered more than once. When photographing documents for Project Albatross, a secret Soviet plan to install bunkers for Warsaw Pact commanders in Poland, Bulgaria, and just outside Moscow. These commanders were always Soviet, by the way. Another military officer walked in on him. Kuklinski quickly palmed his camera and reached for a cigarette, as though the papers were causing him an enormous headache and stress. He was believable that time, but it was never easy. 1980 and 1981 were times of enormous upheaval in Poland. In 1980, the Solidarity strikes horrified the Soviet Union at the pushback against communism, and Kuklinski was privy to all the details. The Soviets massed troops on the Polish border, reminding Poles of what had taken place in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Many Polish military officers were vocally against this Soviet invasion. War games again took place, under the name Soyuz 81, to drive home the point. In September 1981, another set of war games took place as a show of force in the Baltics. On November 2nd, 1981, Kuklinski was informed of a leak at the highest levels of the Polish military. It was time to go. He arranged for exfiltration of himself and his family through the American handlers. Although terrifying and very nearly uncovered at a border checkpoint, the Kuklinski family managed to make it out of Poland. Unfortunately, they were unable to rescue their dog. When Kuklinski's activities came to light, it ignited a firestorm of debate. Hero or traitor? To the NATO nations, obviously he was a hero. To the Soviet Union, the worst sort of traitor. And he was convicted and given a death sentence in absentia in Poland in 1984. But in Poland, things are much more complicated. Kuklinski was a Polish patriot, not a Soviet. His actions were to protect Poland. And absolutely no one denies either his Polish patriotism or his courage. After the fall of communism, when his death sentence was lifted and he was allowed back into Poland in 1998, he gave a speech at Warsaw Castle. In it, he said, "Everything that I did, I was thinking about Poland. Even if my contribution was small, I would stand on the right side of history. And even if, in a broader perspective, my actions did not amount to anything great, I would give my all. That was my entire life's work. I had the great honor to serve in this war on the side of the US, on the side of NATO, on the Polish side against the Soviet evil empire. It is undeniable that Kuklinski greatly affected the outcome of the Cold War. The documents and maps he passed to the US kept NATO and the West one step ahead of planned provocations and able to respond to Soviet moves. At the end of the 1980s, as Eastern Bloc nations began to fall away, the Warsaw Pact itself began to disintegrate. In February 1991, it was declared defunct. In July 1991, Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia formally ended it as an organization. In December 1991, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated. Polish history is rife with turning point moments that rippled through world history. It's from a corner of Poland, Belarus, Ukraine that the Slavic invasion of Europe and settlement of Eastern Europe began in the 6th century. In the 16th century, an agreement with Poland solidified the Habsburg face of Central Europe. Long before Napoleon in 1610, the Poles were able to occupy Moscow for 2 years. In 1683, it was the Polish troops of King Jan III Sobieski that routed the Ottomans at the walls of Vienna and prevented them from advancing further into Western Europe. During World War II, the Polish Home Army provided 48% of all intelligence reports to the British, including a highly dangerous and seemingly impossible operation to smuggle out a German V-2 rocket, as well as the critical information to crack the German Enigma code. And then, Poland was at the center of toppling the Soviet Union. For a nation that's at the center of so many turning points in history, and still is today, there's a remarkable lack of knowledge of Polish history and culture in the West. We hope to fix that in future episodes. As always, there's much more to the history of Poland, the Cold War, and the juxtaposition of these histories with current events. And we have barely even scratched the surface of anything we've discussed. I truly hope you'll use this episode as a jumping off point to learn more. Please read more, go back further, and for heaven's sakes, make sure you can find these places on a map.